Week 2 of 3 this morning of a little short kind of mini series around Easter, looking at the last few chapters of the Gospel of John. So if you weren't with us last week, Jonathan began by looking at the first half of chapter 18 of John, really looking at the fact that Jesus was betrayed. This morning we're going to finish off chapter 18 looking at Jesus on trial. On Friday, we'll gather together on Friday night, and we'll look at John chapter 19. Jesus is crucified. And then next Sunday, we will gather on Easter morning to look at John 20. Jesus is risen. Now, if you would, go ahead and open up your Bibles to John chapter 18. We're going to be starting in verse 19. If you don't have a Bible with you, there should be one under a chair around you. Feel free to grab that. You can use that this morning. You can even take that home with you. If you don't have a good Bible, let that be our gift to you this morning. You can also find the passage in your bulletin, so feel free to find it there. There's some pages for you to take notes if that would be helpful. But as you're turning there and as we're getting ready to dig into John chapter 18, there's really a question above this entire passage. And the question is this: how does a king get condemned as a criminal? How does a king get condemned as a criminal? Now, you might be thinking that is a pretty difficult thing to have happen, but you might imagine some scenarios where that could be the case. He could be a really bad king. He could be a really evil king. He could be a guilty king. But this king isn't that way. This is a king like no other king in all of history. This is a good and righteous king. How does a good and righteous king get condemned as a criminal? Jesus tells us the kind of king that he is. In fact, he, on an afternoon in a synagogue, he reads from a passage in Isaiah, and he says, "This is fulfilled in your presence. This is the kind of king that I am." And he reads from Isaiah 61. And here's the kind of king that Jesus is. Here's what the first three verses of Isaiah 61 says. "The Spirit of the Lord God is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of our God's vengeance, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, festive oil." Oil was a symbol of joy. "Festive oil instead of mourning, splendid clothes instead of despair. And they will be called righteous trees planted by the Lord to glorify him." Jesus proclaims that this is the sort of king that he will be. And in fact, this is exactly what we see in the Gospels. This is the king that Jesus is. And yet at the end of our passage this morning, in the last verse, we're going to see this king made a criminal. How does that happen? Well, that's what John is hoping to show us in the passage this morning. But before we dig into it, I do think we need a warning. See, I think there's a temptation for us as we dig through this passage to ask some questions. How could they possibly do this to Jesus? What kind of guilty people are they that would condemn Jesus as a criminal? I think those are good and right questions to ask of the religious leaders, of Pilate, and of the crowds. But I don't think we can stop there. I think one of our dangers is that so often when we read the Bible, we put ourselves in the spot of the heroes. See, I think we have to ask those questions of ourselves. See, we have to remember as we're going through this passage that it was our sin that put him there. That in fact, we are actually, in our heart of hearts, in our sin, much like the religious leaders, Pilate, and even the crowds. I think John Stott was absolutely right when he said this: before we can begin to see the cross as something done for us, we must first see it as something done by us. If we're ever really going to grasp that the cross is done for us, we have to recognize first that it was something done by us. Here's our main idea this morning. Jesus, the true king, was unjustly condemned by and for guilty people. Jesus, the true king, was unjustly condemned. That's going to be the point of the passage. That's what John is trying to show us. By and for guilty people. Now, just some things to be thinking about as we're working our way through this passage this morning. You might be here this morning and you might not be a Christian. Or maybe you're just not sure if you're a Christian. Maybe you're thinking through these things. Well, the question I think that is before you from the passage this morning is, what will you do with King Jesus? You're going to see some different responses to Jesus this morning, but the question that's out there really for all of us, but especially if you've never really answered this question before, is what will you do with King Jesus? Those of us who have maybe trusted in this King, who are Christians, church, I think the question before us this morning is, have we truly grasped the wonder that it is to have Jesus as our King? Have we truly grasped, are we eager to have Jesus as our King? Now, the way that we're going to work through this passage is we're going to work through it in three scenes. First, we're going to look at Jesus before the religious leaders. Then we're going to look at Jesus before Pilate. And then finally, we're going to look at Jesus before the crowds. So let's begin in John 18, looking at verses 19 through 24. Here's what it says. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus answered him. I've always taught in the synagogue and in the temple where all the Jews gather, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officials standing by slapped Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" "If I have spoken wrongly," Jesus answered him, "give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, why do you hit me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. First section that we're going to look at is Jesus before the religious leaders. Now, if you weren't with us last Sunday, what has happened right prior to this text is that one of the disciples, Judas, has betrayed Jesus, and Jesus has been arrested. And immediately what happens is they take Jesus to Annas. Now, the problem is that Annas is not the current high priest. He's the former high priest. So why are they taking him immediately to this man? Well, I think it's because Annas is sort of like the godfather of high priests. In fact, 4 of his sons will become high priest. And the current high priest is Caiaphas, who's his son-in-law. And so this man is incredibly influential. And really what I think they're trying to do is they're sending him to Annas for Annas to have first kind of crack at Jesus, this wily veteran of a chief priest. And Annas is hoping to kind of sort of set the tone for the rest of the trial. Annas begins by questioning Jesus. He questions about 2 things. First, his followers. Now, he's questioning Jesus about his followers because he wants to see a little bit of who he's up against. He wants to know, how successful has Jesus' ministry been? If we convict Jesus, what's the sort of kind of outpouring that's going to happen? How big is this crowd? But then he examines Jesus about what he's really interested in. He questions Jesus about his teaching. Most likely, it seems that he probably is questioning Jesus about his claims to be the Messiah and his claims to be divine, to be God. Now, Jesus responds in a very, what seems to us, tame and obvious way. He simply says, you don't need to do this. That's essentially what's happening here. My ministry has not been a secret or private ministry. It's been a very public ministry. I taught in the synagogues. People gathered before me. I never held anyone out or barred someone from hearing my teaching. It's been a public ministry. Now, what he means here is not that he never taught in private. Okay, so don't misunderstand Jesus. Of course, he taught his disciples in private. But what he's saying is what I taught them in private is the same thing that I said in public. Jesus is saying, I have nothing to hide. But notice the response. Look back. This is what we're like, wait a second. How could this bring about this kind of response? In verse 22, after Jesus makes this response to say, hey, there are plenty of witnesses out there. You can talk to them about my teaching. Verse 22, one of the officials slaps Jesus in anger for how he is talking to the high priest. Why? That seems a little bit like above. Like that doesn't seem necessary. Well, because Jesus also did something else in his response. He also showed that this is not a fair trial even from the beginning. See, he knows that the protocols and procedures in those days for a trial was that they were to question the witnesses first, especially those witnesses that would have been positive about the defendant. Then they were to question the rest of the witnesses, and then finally they would question the defendant. And so Jesus, even in this response of talking about his public ministry, is also highlighting the fact that you shouldn't be questioning me right now. You're not even following your own sort of regulations for how this trial should go. That's why the soldier or the official is so angry at Jesus, because Jesus is already showing us that these religious leaders care nothing about a fair trial. What they want is an effective one. They have a verdict that they want, and they're ready to get there in any way that they can, as long as it sort of appears just. That's probably why Annas is having the first crack, is he's trying to do this in an informal way to begin with. But the official slaps Jesus. Jesus responds in a way that we might imagine and says, wait a second, if I've done anything wrong or said anything wrong, let me know. Say it. Give evidence of it. But if I haven't, then why are you responding this way? And I think Annas probably, I don't know this for certain, but I'm guessing that he realizes this is not going well. This is not probably how he expected it to go. And so what does he do? He immediately sends Jesus off to his son-in-law, the current high priest, Caiaphas. And then we continue to read in verses 28 through 32 what happens next. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They did not enter the headquarters themselves, otherwise they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you." Pilate told them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." "It's not legal for us to put anyone to death," the Jews declared. They said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, indicating what kind of death he was going to die. Now, John says very little about Jesus' time before Caiaphas, but the other gospel writers give us much more information. And during that time before Caiaphas, they are going to accuse Jesus of blasphemy. They are going to convict Jesus of blasphemy. Jesus is going to say, "I am the Son of Man." Jesus is going to make claims to be the Messiah and even to be divine. And as soon as they get that conviction, they rush off to Pilate. That's the governor's headquarters that we see here. But I want you to note that throughout this passage, there's quite a few instances of irony. John's kind of telling this story, and it's dripping with irony. And verse 28 is an instance of that. Look at verse 28 again. They did not enter the headquarters themselves. So they get to Pilate's, but they don't go inside. Why? Because they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. This would be missing the point. Here are these religious leaders, and they're like, we can't go into Pilate's house. They had man-made rules and tradition that forbid them from going into a Gentile's house unless they be made unclean, and they wanted to continue to celebrate the Passover, so they don't want to go in. And yet, John is highlighting for us these same men that are holding so close to these man-made traditions and regulations are actually instigating the crucifixion of the true Passover lamb. Church, I think this is instructive for us. We need to be aware of pure ritual. Here are people who are so eager to follow the rules, but not the ruler. I just think there's something there for us to be reminded of. It is so good to gather together on Sundays. It is so good to dig in and read God's word. It is so good to pray. It's so good to be with God's people. It's so good to fast and to serve and to do all sorts of things. But don't miss Jesus. Church, I just pray that we would never be a people in all of our sort of things that we do that would miss Jesus. No matter what you're doing this week in any way to worship Christ, don't miss Christ. These religious leaders followed all the regulations, even added a lot of them. There's a danger there. But they missed the point. They missed Jesus. That's what John is sort of highlighting even for us there. But here's what happens. They go to Pilate, and they have this conviction, and they are convinced that Pilate is just sort of going to rubber stamp that. But Pilate doesn't play ball. And the Jews are sort of caught back. See what happens, notice their response. Pilate, he says, "What charge do you bring against this man?" And they're like, well, wait a second, why are you asking this question? That's what's in their minds. We know from last week that there were Roman soldiers at the arrest of Jesus. So I'm sure the Jewish leaders had already had some conversations with the Roman authorities. They thought if we bring Jesus, Pilate's going to be like, all right, done. And yet he goes, what charge do you bring against this man? And they're like, wait a second, frustrated, verse 30, if this man weren't a criminal, if he wasn't already convicted, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. What does Pilate say in verse 31? Well, fine, if you've done all the work, you take it. You go ahead. If you take him, you judge him according to your law. But here's the problem. See, verse 31 at the end, the Jews tell us, but it's not legal for us to put anyone to death. See, Rome was really wise and when they conquered and overtook peoples and places. They would let these peoples and places, for the most part, govern themselves, especially judicially, but they did not allow them to enforce capital punishment. Why? Well, because they knew that anyone who would be sort of in favor to the empire, who would have some sort of encouragement to the empire or who would appreciate the Roman Empire, that these sort of occupied countries and peoples, they'd find ways to get a guilty conviction and make sure that those people were put to death, and that would not be good for the Roman Empire. And so they did not allow any of their conquered peoples to have the death penalty. And so the Jews know that they need to go to Pilate in order to be able to fully convict Jesus and actually have him crucified. Now, you'll notice in the scriptures, there are times when a mob is gathered together and they stone a person to death. And they could have done that, and in fact, they tried to do that a couple times, but the religious leaders know that that's not going to be enough. They need Jesus to be publicly convicted as a criminal and to be crucified in order to stop what he's doing. But then John, in verse 32, says this. He notes that this was their heinous plan, but it was ultimately Jesus' plan. So they said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, indicating what kind of death he was going to die. Jesus had already prophesied that this is how he would die. John chapter 12, verses 32 and 33, he says this, as for me, if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. Verse 33, John tells us, why is Jesus saying this? He said this to indicate what kind of death he was about to die. What sort of death removes you from the ground and puts you above the earth? Crucifixion. So while this is the doing of the religious leaders, Jesus is in control. Now, the question as we look at this sort of point is to see that a righteous king, how does a righteous and good king get condemned as a criminal? Well, what we see so far is not deservedly, not fairly. What we see is that the Jewish leaders wanted this. They instigated this. They manipulated this to happen. Why? What's the motivation of the religious leaders here? Well, John doesn't tell us, but Matthew gives us a hint. Actually, from Pilate, Matthew 27, verse 18, for he, Pilate, knew it was because of envy that they, the religious leaders, had handed him over. Why did they do this? Because they were jealous of Jesus. They were in control, and Jesus was a threat to their control. They were envious of him. John Stott reminds us of this, that envy is the reverse side of a coin called vanity. Nobody is ever envious of others who is not first proud of himself. Have you ever considered that? Every time that we are jealous, every time that we are envious, what we are actually saying in our heart of hearts is that should be me. That should be mine. That's what's motivating the religious leaders. They see Jesus' authority. They see Jesus' power. They see Jesus' following, and they think these followers should follow us. That should be us. It's envy, but it's pride. And when they are unable to slow him down, when they are unable to confound him, when they are unable to better him, they figure out, well, we just have to end him. And we'll do so by any means necessary. Now, I don't think it's too hard to see the application here, to see why we ought not just to read this as these terrible religious leaders. I think that's true, but that we also ought to see ourselves in the religious leaders. We all here this morning battle envy and pride. The same sinful desires that were in the religious leaders, we battle that same sin. I think so often we think that we know best who Jesus should be and what Jesus should do. That's where our envy and pride sometimes shows itself. We know best who Jesus should be and what Jesus should do. We want Jesus' support, but we don't want his challenge. We're very happy with a Jesus that serves our will, but not happy with a Jesus that demands our worship. That's where the struggle begins to happen. Now, we may not resort to killing him. What we do in our day and our sin is most of the time we seek to ignore him. And the way that we do that is we try to make Jesus in our image instead of having Jesus make us in his image. We sort of want Jesus to be a means to our ends instead of being the end himself. Ultimately, what it looks like, even in our relationship with Jesus sometimes, we can worship control over Christ. Now, let me just play that out and how I think that might look in our lives in maybe a few different ways. I wonder if you're here this morning, there's probably some areas or domains of your life that you think, well, this is mine. This isn't Christ's domain. Christ doesn't speak into this domain. This is my domain. Maybe that's at work. Maybe when you get to work, Christ is the furthest thing from your mind, and this is my domain. This is my territory. This is my time. Or maybe more even likely, it's leisure. Maybe it's rest. You think, well, this is the time where I get to do whatever I want to do. This is my domain. Or maybe you're a student in here. You might think it's school. Maybe you think, well, when I'm with my family, I kind of have to follow and obey my parents. At church, I want to hear about Jesus. But at school, this is my time. Or maybe for all of us, it's Saturdays. Well, you can do what you want with the rest of the week, but Saturday is my day, that domain. This is my time. This is my arena. See, I think sometimes our control over Christ can be seen in ways like this. Sometimes I think about it when it comes to anxiety and worry. And it's true for myself. I find that when I am the most anxious and worried is when I am in the least control. Have you ever thought about what that says about who you're trusting in? If we are most anxious and worried when we are not in control, what are we actually trusting in? Our control and not Christ. Or maybe you've been tempted to say something or maybe even think something, Jesus owes me this. There are times, even as Christians, where we can be tempted to think, yeah, but you owe me this one, Christ. Well, if Jesus owes you, that means he's in your debt. And that means in some ways you are in control over Jesus. There are so many different ways in our lives that we can choose control over Christ. Maybe it doesn't look exactly like the religious leaders here, but the essence is the same. When we choose control over Christ, we're actually demeaning Christ as king and really placing ourselves there. It's an important question. Do you want control or do you want Christ? Jesus, the true king, was unjustly condemned by and for guilty people. It's Jesus before the religious leaders. Think about Jesus before Pilate now. Verses 33 through 38, we see Jesus before Pilate. Then Pilate went back into the headquarters. He summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me?" "I'm not a Jew, am I?" Pilate replied. "Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" "My kingdom is not of this world," said Jesus. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." "You are a king then?" Pilate asked. "You say that I'm a king," Jesus replied. "I was born for this, and I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." "What is truth?" said Pilate. After he said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no grounds for charging him." Pilate's first question shows the ingenuity of the religious leaders. See, the religious leaders, they had convicted Jesus of blasphemy, but they knew that Pilate would not care about blasphemy. That was not a threat to the Roman Empire, and so instead, they decide to put Jesus up as a rival king, a threat to Roman rule. And so Pilate's first question is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Well, Jesus needs to clarify. Because there is a sense in which Jesus is king, but he knows he's not the kind of king that Pilate is imagining. And so he clarifies this. And Pilate, he asked, "Is this coming from you? Is this your question, Pilate? Or did somebody else give you this question?" And Pilate's not super happy about that question. He sort of mockingly responds, and he asks a question that's actually far deeper than he knows. He responds by saying, "I'm not a Jew, am I?" So think about this for a second. Jesus, he has said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Is this your question?" And Pilate responds, "Why would I care if you're the king of the Jews? I'm not a Jew." Really, notice what's at the heart of that question. Pilate's saying, I'm not, you're not my king, are you? That's what he's saying. "I'm not a Jew, am I? You're not my king." Now, Pilate is saying that mockingly, but it's actually a far truer question than he knows. It's actually a question that he should be asking. It's actually the question that is before all of us, before all humanity before Christ. But Jesus makes it really clear that his kingdom is different. That he is a king, but he's not the kind of king probably that Pilate is imagining, that his kingdom is not of this world. Now, what he means is he doesn't mean that his kingdom has nothing to do with this world. What he means is that his kingdom is not a worldly kingdom. It's not like other worldly kingdoms. And he proves that. He actually shows that because he says, "Note, look at my followers. My followers aren't fighting my arrest and trial. In fact, I actually forbid them from doing so." I mean, I'm not, if I had a worldly kingdom, then if I was sort of arrested and convicted, then my followers, my people would fight, because that's how worldly kingdoms operate. He says, no, that's not how God's kingdom operates. I think that's so helpful for us to remember, that those of God's kingdom don't fight like those of worldly kingdoms. His kingdom, God's kingdom, never advances by might or force. Such a great reminder for us as Christians. But Pilate, then hearing this, as Jesus describes, "Hey, my kingdom is a different sort of kingdom. It's actually a far greater kingdom." Pilate says, "So then you are a king." It's like, okay, you are a king. And Jesus admits as much. And then he turns the table on Pilate. The judge, Pilate, becomes the judged. If they were sitting in seats, they're switching seats here for a moment, and Jesus sort of puts him on trial. Because Jesus says that he actually was born, and in fact, he came into the world. And when John uses that phrase, when Jesus uses that phrase, and John highlights this phrase that he came into the world, he's pointing us back to John chapter 1. That Jesus was not only born, but he's the God who became a man. That's what John 1's all about. That Jesus is God who became a man. This is the true king in the flesh. And Jesus says, "Here's why I came." And what's his answer? What's his purpose? To testify to the truth. Jesus goes, "You want to know what my kingdom is all about? What me being a king is all about? It's to testify to the truth." Now, I don't think what Jesus is saying here is that I came to tell truths and not lies. He's saying so much more than that. He's not saying less than that, but he's saying so much more than that. What he's saying is, I am the truth. In fact, that's what Jesus says in John 14:6. You remember this passage. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. See, Jesus hasn't come to flip the world upside down by force, but by truth. He's come to reveal the truth in a world plunged in lies. That's the kind of king he is. That's why he's here. He's come to be the way to God and to a world that is in exile from God. Finally, Jesus tells us in this passage that he has come to give life to people who are dead in sin. Jesus says, man, I am a far different king. Right? You can see the irony in this. Here is Pilate, this Roman ruler, and he's actually sitting across from the greatest king that the world has ever known in Jesus. This is what John is showing us again and again. But Pilate actually proves that he's not of God's kingdom. Jesus says that anyone who is of my kingdom listens to my voice. Right? They listen to me. What does Pilate say? He says, what is truth? And then he leaves. Pilate asks a question, what is truth? But I think John is very significantly highlighting this, but he doesn't listen to Jesus' response. Doesn't even give Jesus an opportunity to respond. He's not of God's kingdom. Francis Bacon's pretty famous for saying this. What is truth? Said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. Now, whether or not Pilate was joking, I'm not sure. He could have been really serious, but either way, he did not stay around to hear Jesus' answer. He's not interested in Jesus' response. No, verse 38 shows us that after he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no grounds for charging him. Pilate is at least convinced that Jesus is not a threat. So he says this, and this is the statement of emphasis in John chapter 18, that Jesus is completely innocent. Pilate says, I find no grounds, none at all, for charging him. That should be the end. But notice what happens, and we'll read about this more on Friday in John 19. But even in our passage, Pilate will then go on to use Jesus as a bargaining chip in order to appease the people, the religious leaders, and the crowds. And then John chapter 19, he'll actually have Jesus flogged, hoping that Jesus' suffering will be enough for him to be able to release Jesus. Now remember, Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent, and ultimately Pilate will condemn Jesus to be crucified. Why would Pilate do this? How would Pilate do this for someone who is completely innocent and he knows this? How can he say, I find no charge, and then actually take him, condemn him as a criminal? Well, I think while it was for the religious leaders' control, for Pilate, it was comfort. See, Pilate was not and probably could not afford to have an unnecessary revolt. And so he seeks not justice, but convenience. Instead of doing what he knows is right, Pilate chooses to do what is easy. Now, again, I think that should not be too hard for us to see how in our sinful desires and in our hearts, that there is a little bit of Pilate in us as well. Not only do we sometimes want control over Christ, we often want comfort over Christ. I was thinking about this week how often in situations and times and different maybe conversations that we tend to be really quiet about Jesus. I mean, just think about this morning, how much Christ has done for us. Think about our love and worship of Jesus, and then think about how little we talk of him. Why is it? I mean, there's probably 100 reasons I recognize, but why is it that we are often so quiet about Jesus? I just think often is because we don't want it to be awkward. We're afraid of what the response might be. We want comfort over Christ. Church, I don't think that's only in how we talk about Jesus. I think we expect the Christian life often to be easy and comfortable. I think that's just how we tend to think about it. That's why we often so struggle to initiate difficult, needed, but difficult conversations with one another. I think that's why sometimes we are so slow to admit or confess sin to a close friend, to a brother and sister in Christ, or to a family member, to our kids, to our spouses. We're so slow to confess sin because we expect the Christian life to be easy and comfortable and not follow the call of Christ. I think that's why sometimes it's hard for us to give generously. We're happy to give as long as it doesn't cost us. But to give in a way, C.S. Lewis calls us to give in a way that pinches us, well, that's really difficult for us because we want comfort instead of the call of Christ. I think that's sometimes why it's hard to be present with someone when they are suffering great pain, because sometimes that's awkward. Sometimes we're afraid we don't know what to say. We don't want to endure that sort of space because it's not comfortable. And if we're honest with ourselves, so often we worship comfort over Christ. Now, Pilate's sort of negligence here, his choosing comfort over Christ, it's lesser than the religious leaders. Jesus is going to say that in John 19. But it amounts to the same thing. It's a denial of Jesus as king. Jesus, the true king, was unjustly condemned by and for guilty people. So we've seen Jesus before the religious leaders. We've seen Jesus before Pilate. Now let's look briefly at Jesus before the crowds. Last two verses, Pilate says this, "You have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a revolutionary. Pilate's political maneuvering backfires. He thinks, well, surely they're not going to choose Barabbas. I can make this bargaining chip. And Pilate's thinking, I mean, he's pretty ingenious here. He's thinking, if I do this, if I release Jesus as this custom, I'm releasing him still as a criminal. Now, he's just said that Jesus is innocent, but to appease the religious leaders, he's going to say, well, I'll make Jesus a criminal. That's what this last statement's doing. I'll make Jesus a criminal, but I'll release him so I can kind of have the best of both worlds. But what happens? The people, the religious leaders, even the crowds, many of whom in those crowds just celebrated Jesus' coming into Jerusalem less than a week earlier. They call not for Jesus, but Barabbas. Now, the text doesn't give us much, but some of the other gospel writers give us a little bit more, but we can just safely say that Barabbas was not a good man. Okay, I know it says revolutionary here, but other passages let us know that he probably even was a murderer, but he was certainly a guilty and bad man. And so the crowds and the religious leaders, they're happy to receive this guilty and bad man in order to make Jesus a criminal. See, John is highlighting for us the innocence of Jesus. Jesus is the innocent sufferer. I just want to remind us of what we read in Isaiah 53. You can see how the Bible has told us this is exactly who Jesus would be, and you can see how Jesus shows us exactly what Isaiah 53, 7 through 10 says. Here's what we read this morning. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter and like a sheep silent before her shearers, he did not open his mouth. He didn't fight. He didn't defend. He never even really defended himself. He was taken away because of oppression and judgment. And who considered his fate? For he was cut off from the land of the living. He was struck because of my people's rebellions. Who is calling for him to be crucified? We'll see this even more so in John chapter 19. It's the people of God. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, but he was with a rich man at his death because he had done no violence and had not spoken deceitfully. Jesus is the truly innocent sufferer. But don't miss the picture of Barabbas at the end. This is such a beautiful gospel picture. I don't know that this is what John had in mind, but I'm sure he could see it. Barabbas shows us a far greater reality than what's just happening there. Jesus takes Barabbas' place. Barabbas, the guilty criminal, is released so that Jesus, the innocent one, is made a criminal. Jesus takes what would have been Barabbas' execution so that Barabbas may live. That is such a clear picture of the good news of Jesus. It's why in Isaiah 53:11, we'll read this: "My righteous servant will justify many." How will this righteous, suffering, innocent servant justify many? Well, he will carry their iniquities. So we read in Isaiah 53:11, here is the good news of the gospel, that Jesus, the righteous king, died at the hands of the guilty. But he also died for the guilty. He died in our place, taking our penalties so that we might have life. I don't think anybody could say it better than Octavius Winslow. Here's what he said: "Who delivered up Jesus to die? Not Judas for money, not Pilate for fear, not the Jews for envy, but the Father for love." We ask the question, how does a righteous, innocent, just, good king get condemned as a criminal? The answer: our sin and God's love. How does Jesus get convicted and ultimately crucified? Because of our sin and because of God's great love and mercy. If you're not a Christian here this morning, if you're not sure what it means to be a Christian, here it is. To be a Christian is not about who you are and what you've done. It's not how you become a Christian. What it means to be a Christian is that means that you're about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for you. We do have this question before us: what will we do with King Jesus? I just want to encourage you this morning, recognize that you are a sinner, that you have rebelled against the good God who made you, that you serve yourself in this world, that there is a selfishness deep in your soul. And turn to Jesus Christ, who has made an end to your sin, who has taken the death that you deserve so that you can have life. And church, I just want to remind us how true Stott's quote is. We can't really understand the cross is something done for us until we understand that it is something done by us. But now understanding how we are like the religious leaders, how we are like Pilate, and how we are like the crowds, when we see that the cross is something done by us, do you see how it's something done for us? We don't need to choose control. We don't need to choose comfort. This is our King. We can choose Jesus Christ. Do you see the joy, the delight, the privilege? We should be eager to have this Jesus, the one who is all-powerful, in complete control, the one who humbled himself to die in our place, taking our sin upon himself, and who rose to new life, conquering sin, Satan, and death once and for all. This is our King. And I pray that we would follow him in every single area of our lives. C.S. Lewis gives us a choice. He says, you can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. What a privilege and a joy ought it to be for us in every area of our life, in every season and circumstance, to call this King Lord and God. Jesus, the true King, was unjustly condemned by and for guilty people. Let's pray.